The Wyoming wind never really stopped howling, but that night it felt especially raw, rattling the battered windows of the Miller ranch house as if it wanted inside. Ethan Miller sat hunched at the old kitchen table, a stack of unpaid bills spread out like a poker hand he'd already lost. The overhead light flickered, throwing shadows across his broad shoulders and the tired lines in his face. Life had not spared Ethan much mercy since returning from his last tour. First, the army took his strength, then fate took his wife, and now the world seemed intent on taking what little he had left. Each day bled into the next. Mornings fixing fences, afternoons chasing creditors, evenings staring across the table at his daughter, both of them silent, grief hovering like a ghost between them. Emma Miller was only 10, but in her dark, watchful eyes there was a hope that refused to die. She missed her mother fiercely, but more than that, she missed the laughter their home once knew. These days, Ethan moved through life like he was wading through mud, his words brief and his smiles rare. Emma filled her hours with chores, schoolwork, and long walks beyond the barn, always scanning the horizon for something she wasn't sure what. Sometimes she imagined a miracle was waiting for them out there, somewhere beyond the broken fence line and the relentless prairie wind. That miracle arrived one stormy evening, though it didn't look like much at first. Rain slashed sideways across the fields. Thunder grumbled over the distant buttes. Emma, restless as always, pressed her nose against the cold glass of her bedroom window. That's when she saw the movement by the edge of the barn, a flash of dark, desperate motion against the silver-gray backdrop of the storm. Curiosity pulled her outside, coat forgotten, boots splashing in the muddy yard. She crept around the side of the barn, heart pounding. There, half collapsed in the wet grass, stood a wild Mustang, his coat soaked and shining black as midnight. He trembled, sides heaving, one back leg twisted at an odd angle, blood matting the fur above his hoof. He pinned his ears and snorted at her approach, but it was clear he could barely stand, let alone flee. Emma crouched, arms open, voice low and steady as she whispered nonsense into the roaring night. She could see the fear in the Mustang's eyes, a fear she knew well. The same kind that lived in her father's gaze sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking. Inch by inch, she inched closer, hands outstretched, until the wild horse could sniff her trembling fingers. Inside the house, Ethan was about to pour himself another cup of black coffee when he caught the shape moving outside the window. A child's silhouette, against the blur of rain. He swore under his breath and pulled on his jacket, boots thudding as he hurried out. He found Emma kneeling in the mud beside the injured horse, rain plastering her hair to her cheeks, eyes shining with stubborn compassion. For a long moment, Ethan just stared at them. His daughter and the Mustang, two wounded creatures leaning on each other in the dark. He wanted to drag her away, lecture her on the dangers of wild animals and bad weather. But what came out instead was a tired sigh, softer than he intended. Maybe it was the way the Mustang's ears flicked toward him, more curious than hostile, or the way Emma's hands never shook as she gently brushed the horse's neck. Ethan saw something familiar in the animal's rigid posture and haunted eyes. There was a kinship there, old and deep survivors, recognizing each other by instinct. With a heavy heart, he knelt beside Emma. Together, they coaxed the Mustang into the relative shelter of the barn, fashioning a makeshift stall from hay bales and old rope. The horse shook with pain, but he let Emma clean his wound as best she could, her hands careful and sure. Ethan fetched his wife's old veterinary kit, unused since she passed, and fumbled through the supplies. The act of tending the animal, of working side by side with his daughter in the flickering light, felt almost sacred, an echo of the life they'd lost, and maybe a step toward something new. As the storm spent itself and the thunder faded into memory, the little family huddled in the barn, Ethan, Emma, and the battered Mustang. The barn was drafty, and the future uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, hope glimmered at the edges of Ethan's exhaustion. He could not turn away the wild horse, not tonight. He owed that much to Emma, and maybe to himself. With a final look at the Mustang's dark, wary eyes, Ethan closed the stall door and whispered a silent promise. Tomorrow, he would figure out what to do. But tonight, against all odds, they were together. And that had to be enough. Morning brought a strange hush to the ranch, a brief peace after the storm's chaos. The Wyoming sky was washed clean and blue, sunlight streaming through ragged clouds and painting the fields gold. Ethan Miller rose before dawn, out of habit more than necessity, and stood for a moment at the window, watching as the land emerged from shadow. The Mustang was still in his thoughts, an anxious tug in his chest. A new responsibility they could barely afford, another weight added to the pile. Yet something about the animal lingered with him, like a tune he almost remembered. Down in the barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay, rain, and horse sweat. The Mustang, battered but alive, watched Ethan with wary, intelligent eyes as he approached. He'd made it through the night, his breathing steadier, the blood on his leg now dried in a crust around the wound. Emma was already there, kneeling in the straw, her hands gentle as she coaxed the animal to take sips of water from a battered tin bowl. She'd named him Shadow for his black coat, and the way he seemed to blend with the darkness at the edges of the barn. Shadow's first full day, as part of their broken family, was tense and quiet. Ethan worked the ranch in silence, but his gaze kept drifting back to the barn, where Emma spent her hours soothing the Mustang with hushed words and careful hands. She talked to Shadow the way she used to talk to her mother when no one else was around, confiding secret wishes, half-remembered stories, and childish hopes. In those moments, the pain in her heart seemed to ease, as if the Mustang's presence was stitching invisible wounds she didn't know how to heal herself. That afternoon, Emma decided to brush Shadow's tangled mane and found herself tugging at something stiff beneath the old, battered saddle that had been strapped around his barrel. The saddle was worn, the leather dark with age and use, the silver conchos dulled and flaking. Beneath one flap, the stitching felt odd, too thick, too tight. Emma's fingers, nimble from years of helping with chores, traced the seam and tugged until the stitches gave way, revealing a small weathered pouch sewn into the lining. Heart-thumping, she glanced over her shoulder, then carefully worked the pouch loose. It was heavy with age, the canvas soft and faded. Emma opened it, her breath catching as she pulled out a handful of old, yellowed papers, a journal, battered and frayed, and a folded map marked with lines and strange symbols. She turned the items over in her hands, feeling the weight of something important, though she couldn't quite say why. There was a name written in sharp, faded script on the cover of the journal: Captain Samuel Grant. Ethan entered the barn just as Emma was examining the discovery. At first, he frowned, thinking she'd been playing where she shouldn't. But when he saw the pouch and the name on the journal, the frown deepened into something heavier. He took the journal from her, turning it over with hands that suddenly shook. Captain Grant had been more than a friend, he'd been Ethan's mentor, his steadying force during the worst of the war. The Army had called Grant missing in action, presumed dead, years ago. Seeing his name now, in this place, on the back of a wild Mustang, felt like a message sent across time. They sat together on an overturned feed bucket, Ethan turning the pages with reverence, Emma leaning close to read over his shoulder. The journal was filled with tight, hurried writing dates, locations, cryptic notes about missions gone wrong, and men who couldn't be trusted. There were references to hidden things, secrets best kept buried, and sketches of maps with circles and X's marking unfamiliar territory. Emma's fingers found the old map in the pouch. It was hand-drawn, the paper brittle, marked with faded military coordinates, and strange symbols, arrows, notations, a star deep in the wild country to the west. Ethan's mind spun with memories he'd tried to forget. Late-night conversations with Captain Grant, whispered warnings about corruption, talk of missing supplies, cover-ups, and buried truths that no one wanted to uncover. He realized, slowly, that Shadow was no ordinary Mustang. Someone had entrusted the horse with a secret one that was never meant to be found. And yet, here it was, placed directly in Ethan's hands, as if by fate. Over the next days, the ranch seemed to hold its breath. Ethan spent his evenings poring over the journal and map, piecing together clues, while Emma devoted herself to Shadow's care. The Mustang grew stronger, the wound healing, the wariness in his eyes softening as he learned to trust Emma's presence. Sometimes, in the blue hour just before dusk, Ethan would watch them from the porch, his daughter and the horse, side by side, in the dying light, and feel the stirrings of something like hope. Still, unease nagged at him. If Captain Grant had hidden these things so well, if he'd trusted them to a wild Mustang, there must be danger in the truth. Yet the memory of Grant's voice in his mind, insistent, brave, unwilling to let a lie stand, pushed Ethan forward. He knew he could not ignore this secret. Not now. Shadow, once just a wounded stray on a stormy night, had become the key to a mystery bigger than their own pain. And as the moon rose over the silent Wyoming fields, Ethan realized that the storm which brought the Mustang had changed everything. The past was stirring. The truth was calling. And with Emma and Shadow by his side, he felt a resolve growing inside him. For the first time in a long while, Ethan Miller was ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed felt like living on the edge of a revelation. Each morning, the sunlight found Ethan Miller at the kitchen table. The battered journal spread open before him, coffee growing cold by his elbow. Emma, always nearby, watched her father's face as he read, trying to decipher the puzzle in his eyes. Outside, Shadow grew stronger by the hour, his limp barely noticeable now, his coat glossy beneath Emma's devoted grooming. Around them, the Wyoming ranch quietly pressed on. Fences needed mending, livestock needed feeding, the rhythm of survival refusing to break for mysteries or old ghosts. But inside the Miller home, change was already in motion. The journal's pages revealed fragments of a story Ethan had only glimpsed during his years in uniform. A web of betrayal, missing shipments, names crossed out in anger or fear. Some passages were little more than warnings scrawled in the margins. Trust no one. Eyes everywhere. Others hinted at something deeper, a cover-up that had haunted Captain Grant, and now reached across time to find Ethan. One afternoon, as wind rattled the siding and dusk crept across the fields, Ethan spread the map on the table. The military coordinates were handwritten, familiar yet foreign, pointing toward a region of Wyoming he remembered only from stories and rumors. There were markings he recognized. A cluster of circles near the edge of the Badlands, an X drawn over what looked like an abandoned missile silo, and beside it, a word underlined 3 times, evidence. It all pointed toward secrets hidden in the wild, waiting to be uncovered by anyone brave or foolish enough to try. Ethan tried to talk himself out of pursuing it. There was too much at stake. The ranch, Emma's safety, their fragile peace. Yet every night, the thought of Captain Grant's trust, his faith in Ethan, weighed on him like a silent challenge. The world had already taken too much from him, his wife, his career, his sense of purpose. Maybe this was a chance to reclaim something lost, to fight for a truth that mattered. Emma, perceptive beyond her years, saw the struggle in her father's silence. When she asked him about the journal, her voice was gentle, but her eyes sparkled with the same stubborn light that made her ride out into storms and comfort wounded animals. Ethan tried to brush her off, but Emma persisted, reminding him that secrets festered in the dark, and that Shadow, too, was part of whatever mystery Captain Grant had left behind. In the end, it was her quiet determination that tipped the balance. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the last of the golden light spilled across the yard, Ethan packed the journal and map into his battered duffel. Emma watched from the barn, her hand resting on Shadow's neck. The air was thick with anticipation and the sense that nothing would be the same after tonight. That's when the first sign appeared that they weren't alone in this search. As Ethan secured the barn door, he noticed a pickup parked just beyond the tree line, engine idling, headlights dark, a figure barely visible behind the wheel. The truck lingered long enough to be noticed, then turned and disappeared down the gravel road, leaving Ethan's heart pounding and his instincts screaming. The next morning, tire tracks cut fresh scars through the mud near the far pasture, and the mailbox hung open, contents scattered by the wind. The feeling of being watched settled on the ranch like an unwelcome guest. At night, Ethan double-checked the locks and slept with a flashlight beside the bed. Emma, sensing his unease, grew quiet, but she continued to visit Shadow every evening, whispering secrets to the Mustang, as if the horse himself could ward off whatever danger crept closer. By the third day, Ethan could no longer deny the truth someone else was looking for what Captain Grant had hidden. The sense of urgency pressed in, shrinking their world until the only path forward was the one marked by Grant's old map and the courage in Emma's eyes. Ethan realized that running or hiding wouldn't protect them now. If they wanted answers, they would have to go looking for them out there in the wild, with the past nipping at their heels. Before dawn broke the following morning, Ethan woke Emma and told her to pack a small bag. There was no need for arguments. She understood, just as he did, that this was bigger than either of them. Together, they loaded Shadow with the supplies: rope, canteen, a flashlight, and the old map that had led them to this point. The ranch faded behind them as the three of them, man, child, and Mustang, set out for the horizon, hearts heavy with fear, but also something else, something stronger. Somewhere beyond the familiar fields and the ragged edge of the prairie, secrets waited to be unearthed. The shadow of the past was on their trail, but so was the possibility of redemption and a new beginning. With every step away from the safety of home, the Miller family drew closer not just to Captain Grant's secret, but to the courage and hope they'd thought the world had stolen from them forever. The land beyond the Miller ranch was a patchwork of wild sage, rocky outcrops, and distant, rolling hills that seemed to go on forever beneath the broad Wyoming sky. With dawn painting the clouds in pink and amber, Ethan and Emma set out, Shadow's black coat gleaming as he led the way into a world both familiar and unknown. They traveled light, carrying only what they could fit in a single worn saddlebag: Grant's journal, the cryptic map, a canteen of water, and a handful of supplies. Each step away from the ranch was a step deeper into uncertainty, but also into purpose, a feeling Ethan hadn't known in years. Shadow moved with careful confidence, seeming to sense the gravity of the mission. Emma rode with quiet pride, her hands gentle on the reins, her eyes bright with the thrill of adventure. Ethan walked beside them, boots crunching on gravel, head turning at every unusual sound. The landscape felt watchful, every breeze whispering of secrets and hidden dangers. For a while, all was still. Coyotes watched from the ridges. Hawks traced slow circles overhead. The only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional creak of leather. By midday, the terrain grew more challenging. Narrow gullies twisted between boulders, prickly scrub tugged at their boots, and patches of muddy ground threatened to swallow their tracks. Ethan's eyes flicked to the horizon again and again, searching for signs of pursuit. More than once, he caught a flash of movement behind them, a glint of metal, the dust plume of a distant vehicle. Whoever was searching for Grant's secret was not far behind, and they moved with the patience of men who had done this before. As the sun dipped lower, they reached the first landmark from the map. An abandoned gas station, its sign half buried in tumbleweeds, windows long ago, shattered by wind and time. The silence here was deeper, broken only by the distant echo of a lone crow. Ethan led Emma and Shadow around back, scanning for threats, heart hammering in his chest. He motioned for Emma to stay close, a protective instinct rising stronger than fear. They found a sheltered spot behind the crumbling station, resting briefly as Ethan studied the map. He traced a faded red line with his finger, trying to calculate their next move. The world seemed to hold its breath until the crunch of gravel shattered the quiet. A shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the station, moving with purpose, eyes hidden beneath a battered ball cap. He looked ordinary enough, but the tension in his stance told another story. Ethan tensed, every sense alert. The man's gaze lingered on the Mustang, then flicked to the duffel bag slung across Ethan's shoulder. The encounter lasted less than a minute, but it stretched like an eternity. The man spoke in a low voice, words lost to the wind, but the warning in his tone was unmistakable. He gestured toward the road, shaking his head, and then leaned in close enough that Ethan caught the cold glint of a weapon beneath his jacket. Whatever secrets Grant had left behind, this stranger was determined to keep them buried. Ethan stood his ground, shielding Emma with his body, adrenaline sharpening every detail. The man's calloused hands, the faded tattoo on his wrist, the way his boot kicked at a piece of broken glass. For a breathless moment, it seemed violence would break the standoff. Then Shadow, sensing the rising tension, pawed the ground and let out a piercing whinny that echoed across the empty lot. The sound was wild and electric, a call to action that shattered the stranger's composure. The man backed away, muttering something that sounded like a threat, then melted into the gathering dusk, boots scuffing on broken concrete. Ethan watched him go, muscles rigid, eyes searching for any other signs of danger. Emma clung to Shadow, her breath shaky, her usual composure rattled by the sudden nearness of real peril. Ethan squeezed her shoulder, forcing calm into his voice as he led them away from the station. There was no time to rest now. If their pursuers were this close, they would have to move quickly, relying on Shadow's speed and instincts to keep them ahead. They pressed onward, following narrow game trails through dense stands of sage and scrub. The ground sloped downward, the air growing colder as dusk surrendered to night. Somewhere behind them, engines growled to life, headlights sweeping the landscape in slow, searching arcs. Ethan urged Emma to keep low, keeping Shadow between them and the open spaces. The world had shrunk to a corridor of fear and flight, every sound magnified by the darkness. Hours later, when they finally dared to rest, they crouched in a shallow ravine, hidden from the roads above. Shadow stood guard at the mouth of the gully, ears twitching at every whisper of wind. Emma leaned into her father's side, exhaustion and adrenaline warring in her small frame. Ethan pulled her close, promising silently that he would keep her safe no matter what. The night deepened around them, alive with the threat of pursuit and the weight of all they carried. But for now, they were together, shadows among shadows, holding tight to courage and hope as the chase truly began. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Wyoming Badlands, painting the world in harsh relief. Ethan, Emma, and Shadow pressed forward, guided by the lines and coordinates on Captain Grant's map and the urgency nipping at their heels. After a restless night hiding in the ravine, every muscle in Ethan's body ached, but determination fueled each step. Emma, perched atop Shadow, clung tightly to the battered journal and tried to swallow her fear, her wide eyes drinking in the strange, forbidding landscape. The terrain was unforgiving, littered with sagebrush, jagged rocks, and gnarled juniper. The silence was broken only by the steady crunch of hooves and boots, the wind whistling across empty stretches of land. As the sun climbed, the outline of a hidden valley appeared ahead, masked by dense sage and shadowed by tall, crumbling cliffs. Ethan studied the map for the 100th time, feeling the pull of fate and memory as the trail led them toward the secret Grant had buried. Tucked deep within the valley, partially concealed by overgrowth and years of neglect, they found it. An old missile silo, its metal door mottled with rust and nearly swallowed by tangled weeds. The place looked deserted, the concrete slabs broken and scattered, the entrance half hidden beneath a landslide of dirt. Emma slid down from Shadow's back, her breath catching in her chest as she gazed at the relic of another era, a silent monument to secrets and wars long past. Ethan approached with caution, every sense alert for the hint of danger. The journal offered clues, a sequence of numbers, a memory of Captain Grant's steady voice, reciting codes during tense nights on distant bases. He brushed away the dirt, searching for the keypad hidden beneath a rusted panel, and punched in the numbers. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of ancient gears, the heavy metal door shifted, revealing a yawning darkness below. Dust and cold air spilled out, carrying the scent of earth, old oil, and something older, still secrecy itself. Inside, the silo was a tomb of forgotten history. Their footsteps echoed down steep stairs, the beam of Ethan's flashlight darting across metal walls scrawled with warnings and peeling paint. Emma held Shadow's reins, her heart pounding as the Mustang followed with uncanny calm, hooves striking sparks from the grated floor. Each step downward felt like a descent into another world, a place untouched by sunlight and alive with ghosts of the past. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a chamber lined with steel cabinets and rusting lockers, military records spilling out across the floor. Faded photographs, dog tags, and coded files littered the ground. Ethan moved quickly, rifling through drawers, guided by the notes in Grant's journal. He uncovered a battered file stamped classified inside. Names and numbers matched Grant's cryptic lists. Stolen weapons, misallocated funds, false reports sent up the chain of command. There, too, were photographs of men Ethan recognized. Men who had shaped his own years in uniform. Some now dead, others elevated to powerful positions. The evidence was damning. The story spelled out in hard, undeniable lines. But Shadow was uneasy, head tossing, ears flicking back toward the echoing darkness beyond the chamber. Suddenly, the heavy slam of the silo door reverberated through the metal corridors above. Footsteps, muffled but hurried, sounded on the stairs. Emma pressed herself against the wall, clutching the journal, fear turning her limbs to lead. Shadow backed up, muscles tense, eyes wild with warning. Armed men descended into the silo, their faces hidden behind balaclavas and mirrored sunglasses. Voices clipped and urgent. They spread out, blocking the exit, weapons raised, intent clear in every movement. Ethan recognized the hard, efficient way they moved. These were professionals, sent to retrieve whatever secrets he'd uncovered and ensure no one left to tell the tale. Ethan and Emma ducked behind an overturned cabinet, breath held tight as boots crunched closer. In the shadows, Shadow stood perfectly still, blending into the gloom. The Mustang's nostrils flared, picking up every scent, every vibration in the air. The men shouted warnings, sweeping their flashlights across the cluttered room. One man stepped too close, his boot nudging the cabinet, his gun drawn. Emma stifled a sob, clutching the journal tight to her chest. In that desperate moment, Shadow acted. With uncanny precision, he stamped a hoof against the side wall, drawing attention away from Ethan and Emma. The hollow sound echoed strangely, different from the metallic clang of the rest of the silo. Ethan's mind raced. He remembered Grant's notes, vague references to hidden passageways and emergency escape. Heart pounding, Ethan crept along the wall, feeling for a seam, a latch, anything. His fingers found a loose panel, and, with a shove, it swung inward, revealing a narrow passage leading deeper into the earth. Ethan pulled Emma through just as the armed men caught sight of them. Shadow, faithful and unflinching, blocked the entry for a crucial second, before slipping through after them, the panel swinging shut behind his tail. In pitch blackness, guided only by memory and Shadow's instinct, the three fugitives pressed on, boots and hooves muffled in the dirt. Voices and curses rang out behind them, growing faint as they put distance between themselves and the silo's main chamber. They crawled through the tight passage, every moment a test of nerve and faith, until finally the tunnel widened into an old supply room littered with dust and forgotten rations. For now, they were safe. They had the evidence, the journal, and most important, each other. But the danger was far from over, and the dark tunnels beneath the silo would soon reveal new threats and new secrets before their journey could end. The air inside the hidden tunnel was close and heavy, thick with the scent of earth, rust, and old fear. Each step Ethan took sent echoes ricocheting off concrete and steel, the sound swallowed quickly by the depths. Shadow moved just ahead, his ears flicking, nostrils wide, pausing at every junction and sniffing the stale air as if mapping out invisible trails. Emma kept close to her father's side, one hand gripping his sleeve, the other wrapped tight around the battered journal that had led them here. In this darkness, she seemed smaller than ever, but her eyes were wide and sharp, refusing to let fear swallow her whole. Somewhere above, the shouts and heavy boots of their pursuers reverberated through the silo's main corridors. The searchers were methodical, their voices bouncing between steel walls, every order clipped and urgent. Ethan's heartbeat matched the pounding rhythm, adrenaline sharpening his senses and numbing the ache in his limbs. He could picture the men fanning out through the silo, searching every corner, knowing their prey had vanished, but unwilling to give up the chase. The passage wound deeper, the walls pressing in. Once or twice, Ethan paused at intersections marked by faded stencils. Supply, Massachusetts Intenance. Vent hesitating only long enough for Shadow to choose the route. The Mustang's calm steadied them all. At one point, Emma stumbled on a broken piece of pipe, and Shadow paused, lowering his head so she could lean on him until she regained her footing. The simple gesture of comfort in that haunted place brought tears stinging to Ethan's eyes. They passed through old storerooms, shelves buckling under the weight of rotting rations, boxes of outdated medical supplies, and rusted tools. The detritus of decades filled every corner, blankets crawling with dust, tin cups stacked in precarious towers, papers curling and yellowed with age. At one table, a radio set rested beneath a tangle of wires, a relic of another time, when these tunnels hummed with purpose. The sight gave Ethan pause. He moved closer, brushing the dust aside, and recognized the make and model. He reached for the dials, praying the generator lines still worked, or that enough battery remained to reach anyone on the outside. Emma watched as her father struggled with the controls, her breath held tight in her chest. Shadow stood sentry at the tunnel mouth, eyes never leaving the darkness behind them. Ethan turned the dials, static roaring to life, then fading to silence. For minutes that stretched like hours, he called for help, giving old codes, calling the only name he still trusted in the world, a friend from the service, a man who owed him more than a few favors. There was no answer. He tried again, the radio spitting static, his voice growing hoarse and desperate. Just as he was about to give up, a crackle broke through, then a faint voice, wavering but real. He gave their position, spoke quickly, urged discretion. Then, before he could say more, the radio went dead with a fizz and pop, leaving behind a silence that buzzed in their ears. Shouts and hurried steps echoed again, closer this time. The armed men had found the open panel, had tracked them through the dust of the hidden passage. Ethan gestured for Emma to stay low. Shadow pressed himself into the shadows, becoming a living ghost in the gloom. They moved on, deeper into the warren of tunnels, seeking distance and safety. Every heartbeat was a drumbeat of tension, every scuff of boots behind them a threat looming larger. The tunnel forked again. Ethan hesitated, his mind running over Grant's notes, trying to recall the cryptic directions scribbled in the margins. Follow the cold air, he remembered. Trusting instinct, he turned left, where the draft was strongest. The air grew sharper, tinged with the faintest hint of sage and wild grass, proof that somewhere, however distant, there was a way out. But progress was slow. Emma's legs trembled, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. She pressed on, refusing to complain, her small body shivering in the chill. Ethan longed to scoop her into his arms, to tell her that everything would be all right. But there was no time and no guarantee. Instead, he put his hand on her shoulder, a silent promise to keep moving, to survive. Shadow paused ahead, his body tense, ears pricked toward a faint metallic rattle echoing from a side tunnel. Ethan listened, recognizing the rhythm. A vent, maybe, or an old maintenance shaft. It was a risk, but so was every other choice. Trusting the Mustang, Ethan pushed open a narrow service hatch, squeezing through with Emma and Shadow close behind. Inside, the space was cramped but offered a new vantage point. A shaft leading upward, shafts of faint daylight trickling through cracks high above. It wasn't much, but it was hope. For now, they would rest here, catching their breath, rationing what little water they had left. Ethan scrawled a quick message on a torn scrap of paper, leaving it near the entrance in case the authorities arrived before the danger did. Above them, the world moved on, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the earth below. But here, in the silent dark, Ethan, Emma, and Shadow huddled close, not just hiding, but waiting for a chance, one last, slim hope that help would come before their enemies found them. The silence was thick with anticipation, every second stretched thin. But in the presence of his daughter and the faithful Mustang, Ethan felt a glimmer of resolve. They would not be broken, not here, not now, not after coming so far. Time passed strangely in the dark, airless tunnels beneath the silo. Every moment was both hurried and endless, a twisting line between hope and dread. Ethan kept one ear trained to the distant thud of footsteps echoing through the concrete maze, his mind replaying Grant's journal entries like a private code. Beside him, Emma held on, quiet, exhausted, but with the same stubborn spark that had brought them this far. Shadow shifted, restless, his breath a soft presence in the cramped shaft, ready to move at the first sign of trouble. They rationed water and energy, listening for any hint of rescue or danger. Ethan's mind wandered back to his radio call. Would help really come, or had he spoken into a void? Trust was a dangerous thing, forged in war and broken in peace. Yet somewhere in his gut, hope flickered, fragile but persistent. That hope swelled when the sound of boots changed. The pace was different, the echoes steadier, one set. Not many. Then a voice called softly down the tunnel, using a nickname only a handful of men from Ethan's past would know. Ethan's breath caught. He recognized that voice, worn thin by years and distance, belonging to Sergeant Mike Hanley, a man who had pulled him out of fire more than once in another life. With relief and disbelief, Ethan moved from hiding, motioning for Emma to stay back. Hanley rounded the corner, face streaked with sweat and grime, but smiling with grim determination. He moved quickly, whispering that the authorities were on their way, that Ethan's message had reached the right people. Emma rushed to Ethan's side, tears sparkling in her eyes. Shadow stood between them and the new arrival, tense but obedient. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt back toward hope. Hanley urged them down a side corridor, promising a safer route and a hidden exit. Ethan's guard lowered a notch. For the first time since entering the silo, the weight on his chest eased. They pressed deeper into the tunnels, guided by Hanley's quick instructions and steady pace. But even as they moved, something nagged at Ethan's senses. The way Hanley's eyes darted, the sweat on his brow, the faint tremor in his hands. In war, you learn to read people with your life in the balance, and now those instincts hummed like an alarm. Hanley kept glancing at his watch, urging them faster. He avoided Shadow's eyes, kept his back tight to the wall. Suddenly, a figure blocked their way ahead, a man with a cold, professional air, weapon at the ready, face set in hard lines. Hanley stopped, signaled for Ethan and Emma to wait. In that moment, betrayal hit Ethan like a fist to the chest. Hanley turned, gun drawn, face twisted by regret. He admitted the truth. The men who wanted the evidence had gotten to him first. They'd offered safety, maybe money, and the chance to walk away clean if he delivered Ethan and the journal. Shock rooted Ethan to the spot. Emma gasped, clutching Shadow's mane, her faith in heroes shattering in a single heartbeat. The other man moved forward, gun raised, ready to finish the job. Hanley looked away, unable to meet Ethan's eyes. For a heartbeat, everything paused, a standoff weighted by broken trust and cold steel. That was when Shadow exploded into action. Sensing the threat, the Mustang surged forward, rearing and slamming his hooves against the tunnel wall. The confined space magnified the chaos. Dust clouded the air, concrete chips flew, and the gunman stumbled back, firing wildly. Hanley flinched, the weapon in his hand wavering as memories of old battles blurred with the present. In the confusion, Emma darted to Ethan's side, pressing something small and cold into his palm. His pocket knife slipped from her own bag in a desperate, silent act. Ethan didn't hesitate. Years of training and survival instinct took over. He twisted free, launching himself at Hanley, the blade finding its mark in a disarming move. Hanley fell, winded and shocked, but alive. The gunman, stunned by Shadow's onslaught and Ethan's attack, lost his footing. Ethan wrestled the weapon away, adrenaline surging, heart hammering. Emma clung to Shadow, the Mustang's wild energy keeping the remaining threat at bay. Ethan shouted for her to run, and together, they darted into a side passage, leaving the gunman and the wounded Hanley behind in the chaos. Shadow barreled after them, hooves echoing like thunder in the narrow tunnel. The trio ran through the darkness, led now by instinct and desperation. The maze of the silo seemed endless, each turn revealing new shadows and hidden dangers. Ethan's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. Emma's hand was in his, refusing to let go. Behind them, the shouts of their pursuers faded, replaced by the distant wail of sirens. Authorities at last, storming the labyrinthine complex. They pushed on, guided by the faintest hint of daylight and Shadow's unwavering courage. The betrayal lingered like a bitter taste in Ethan's mouth, but so did a renewed resolve. They had survived the impossible together, father, daughter, and horse wounded, battered, but unbroken. The tunnels beneath the silo shuddered with distant noise, sirens screaming above, boots pounding on steel. The chaos of a world closing in. Ethan, Emma, and Shadow surged through the darkness, lungs burning and hearts pounding, hunted by both enemies and fate. Their path twisted between rusted ladders and broken grates, the walls vibrating with every explosion of sound. For a moment, it felt as if the whole earth was ready to swallow them, secrets, betrayals, and all. But as they rounded a final corner, the passage opened into the heart of the silo. A vast, echoing chamber that had once sheltered missiles and men, now a graveyard of history. Here, broken consoles lay scattered. Paperwork drifted in slow motion, and fluorescent bulbs flickered weakly above the dust. It was here that the final act would play out, surrounded by relics of power and fear. Ethan wasted no time. He scanned the room for exits and spotted a metal stairwell climbing toward a hatch and a flicker of daylight. But before they could move, footsteps thundered down behind them, armed men in black, the same mercenaries who'd tracked them from the barn to the Badlands. Their leader stepped forward, face cold and composed, the weight of authority and violence in every line of his body. This was the man at the center of the conspiracy. The military contractor who had corrupted Grant's memory and buried the evidence in blood and silence. He demanded the journal, voice steely and low, his eyes flicking to Emma and the battered folder clutched in her hands. Ethan stood his ground, shielding his daughter, Shadow pressing close, with a defiant snort. For a moment, time seemed to stall, as if the entire silo held its breath. Then the contractor signaled his men. Weapons raised. Threats hissed through the air. Ethan's mind raced. He knew there was no way to outfight this force, but maybe, just maybe, they could outwit them. He handed the folder to Emma, whispering for her to stay close and trust him. As the mercenaries fanned out, Shadow pawed the ground, energy coiled and ready. The leader advanced, pulling a lighter from his pocket and flicking a flame beneath the journal's edge, a clear threat to destroy the only proof left of Grant's sacrifice. In that instant, chaos erupted. Emma, drawing on every lesson of courage and trust, darted behind Shadow. The Mustang reared, hooves flashing, scattering the mercenaries as Ethan lunged forward, knocking the lighter from the contractor's hand. The flame died, but a shot rang out, ricocheting off steel, sending sparks into the piles of papers. Smoke curled upward, the first thread of fire adding to the frenzy. Shadow's instincts kicked in. The Mustang barreled between Ethan and Emma, drawing the mercenaries' attention, his massive frame blocking their advance. Ethan grabbed Emma, yanked her behind a fallen locker, and tore through the scattered documents. He found what he needed, an emergency phone, old but functional, its cord miraculously intact. With trembling hands, he dialed the number he'd used on the radio, shouting their position before the signal fizzled. Above, the hatch banged open, sunlight flooding the room. Uniformed officers swarmed down the stairwell, voices booming, orders sharp and clear. The tide turned in an instant, guns aimed now at the mercenaries, not at Ethan and Emma. The leader cursed, realizing too late that the net had closed. He tried to burn the evidence, reaching for the lighter again. But Ethan tackled him, wrestling the man to the ground in a final burst of desperate strength. Shouts and gunfire echoed. The mercenaries surrendered, dropping their weapons and raising their hands as the authorities swept through the chamber. Handcuffs clicked shut, the mastermind's fury giving way to cold defeat as officers read him his rights. Hanley, Ethan's old friend, was among those arrested. His betrayal, written in the slump of his shoulders, and the way he couldn't meet Ethan's eyes. The battle for Grant's legacy was over. As the adrenaline faded, Ethan pulled Emma and Shadow close. The trio stood at the edge of the chamber, surrounded by fallen papers, broken history, and the soft, golden light of dawn streaming through the open hatch. Emma clung to her father, tears streaming down her face. Tears of exhaustion, relief, and the end of fear. Shadow lowered his head, pressing his nose gently to Emma's hand, as if to promise her that, this time, the worst was over. The authorities moved quickly, collecting evidence, tending to wounds, and herding the mercenaries away. An officer handed Ethan a bottle of water and clapped him on the shoulder. Grant's journal, battered but intact, was placed gently into Emma's arms. The chain of secrets, at last, was broken. Truth had found its way to the surface. The silo, once a place of shadows and secrets, now rang with the sounds of justice and new beginnings. Ethan looked down at Emma and Shadow, his daughter, and the Mustang who had become their guardian, and knew the hardest part was behind them. Together, battered but unbroken, they climbed the stairs toward the Sunday. Sunlight washed over the battered silo as Ethan, Emma, and Shadow finally stepped out into the open Wyoming air. Behind them, the chaos of the last hour's shouts, arrests, the heavy thud of boots, and clink of handcuffs was quickly swallowed by the wind. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the scent of sage and earth, dust and freedom. Above them, a few thin clouds floated across a sky so blue it hurt the eyes, a striking contrast to the darkness they had left below. Officers moved quickly, securing the perimeter, cataloging evidence, and leading the captured mercenaries away. The mastermind contractor was silent and cold, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unable to undo the mountain of evidence, now being loaded into evidence bags. Grant's journal, the classified files, lists of names and numbers that would unravel years of corruption. Emma watched, eyes wide and red from exhaustion, clutching Shadow's mane for comfort. The Mustang, ever steady, stood as a living shield at her side. A young lieutenant approached Ethan, pressing a bottle of water into his hands and offering a quiet nod of respect. Soon, higher officials arrived. Army brass and local sheriffs, men and women in suits, all moving with the measured urgency of people who knew the world had changed. One officer, with silver hair and somber eyes, greeted Ethan with a handshake that lingered a second longer than necessary. There were no words for all that had been lost and reclaimed. But the message was clear. The truth would no longer be buried. A press conference unfolded at the edge of the silo, with Emma and Shadow watching from a safe distance. Ethan stood before a row of microphones, Captain Grant's journal in hand, flanked by officers and government officials. He spoke of bravery and sacrifice, of a man who had refused to turn away from injustice, and of a family's determination to honor the past. The camera flashes blinked like fireflies, and for the first time in years, Ethan's voice rang out with strength, no longer burdened by shame or silence. The military announced that Captain Grant's name would be cleared. His service would be recognized publicly. The dark cloud of suspicion that had shadowed his legacy finally lifted. A ceremony was planned at the state capitol, medals to be awarded. A folded flag returned to a grieving family who had waited far too long for answers. Ethan and Emma were invited as honored guests, their courage in exposing the truth praised on every television in the state. Local newspapers ran stories of the Miller family's ordeal, always featuring a photograph of Shadow the wild Mustang, who had carried the secret and never faltered. In the days that followed, Ethan felt his burdens begin to lift. The ranch's debts, once an ever-present threat, were paid off by a reward fund set aside for whistleblowers and heroes. Checks arrived in the mail with crisp official seals, enough to repair the sagging fences, replace the leaky roof, and buy a new truck to replace the battered one lost somewhere along their escape. But more than money, it was the sense of relief that filled the Miller home, a feeling of safety and hope that had been missing for too long. The townsfolk, who had watched Ethan's struggles from a distance, began to come by with pies and casseroles, awkward words of support, and pats for Shadow. Emma found herself the center of attention at school, friends and teachers asking her to retell the adventure, their eyes wide with awe and disbelief. The story of the girl and her Mustang spread through town like wildfire, whispered at coffee shops and shared at the local diner. For Emma, the sudden attention was overwhelming, but she found comfort in the simple things: quiet mornings brushing Shadow's coat, afternoons exploring the ranch, evenings spent with her father as laughter began to return to their home. Ethan felt the change most keenly in the quiet moments. The guilt and anger he had carried since Grant's disappearance faded, replaced by a steady pride. He visited Grant's family, delivering the journal and speaking of the man who had taught him to be brave, to trust in the truth. At the military ceremony, Ethan stood beside Grant's widow and children, receiving the folded flag and a medal for courage. He did not cry, but he felt the years of loss and regret lift away with the sound of the bugler's final note. Shadow became something of a legend in the county. The Mustang, once a wild, wounded creature, now stood tall and healthy, a hero in his own right. Local news crews came to film Emma and Shadow galloping across the fields, the story of their bond reaching audiences far beyond Wyoming. Children left apples at the ranch fence, hoping for a glimpse of the famous horse. At night, Emma whispered her dreams to Shadow, confident now that anything was possible. As summer faded into fall, the Miller family settled into a new rhythm. The ranch was alive with the sounds of hammers, laughter, and hoofbeats. Ethan was no longer a man haunted by the past, but a father who had fought for the future. Emma, once lonely and unsure, glowed with a new confidence. Shadow, trusted companion and silent witness, remained ever close, a living symbol of healing, loyalty, and the enduring power of hope. A hush settled over the Miller ranch in the days after the dust had cleared. The headlines faded, and the last reporters drifted away. What remained was a sense of deep, abiding peace. Something rare and almost sacred after so much loss, danger, and turmoil. The Wyoming wind still swept over the fields, but its voice now seemed softer, carrying the promise of new days rather than warnings of storms to come. Ethan Miller moved through his home with a lighter step, his shoulders no longer hunched under invisible burdens. The kitchen table, once crowded with bills and silent grief, now saw the gentle mess of family life. Emma's schoolbooks, freshly cut wildflowers in a jar, a horseshoe left to be polished for luck. Laughter had returned to the house, echoing down the halls and out onto the porch in the golden afternoons. Sometimes Ethan caught himself just listening, letting the sound sink deep into his bones like a healing balm. On the ranch, the seasons shifted. Autumn brought fiery leaves, a crispness in the air, and the earthy scent of hay stacked high in the barn. Repairs moved steadily, new shingles on the roof, fresh paint on weathered boards, and sturdy fence posts tracing neat lines along the fields. The money from the reward had done more than save the ranch. It had given the Millers a chance to breathe, to imagine futures that once seemed out of reach. Emma flourished in this new world. The quiet, watchful girl who once wandered the ranch with only her hopes and secrets now filled her days with friends, lessons, and laughter. She found a new confidence, not only in herself but in the love and strength of her family. Her teachers noticed the change, a spark in her eyes, a readiness to help, and a gentle resilience that inspired others. At home, she became her father's right hand, her bond with Shadow deepening in ways that words could never quite capture. Shadow remained the heart of the ranch, a living legend whose story had traveled far beyond Wyoming's borders. Visitors still stopped at the gate, hoping for a glimpse of the black Mustang who had carried a family through darkness into the light. Children pressed their noses to the fence, watching as Emma rode Shadow across the open field, her laughter rising with the wind. The horse, once wary and broken, moved with a strength and grace, born from trust, his faith in Emma absolute, his spirit unbroken. As winter approached, Ethan found himself drawn to service. Inspired by all they had survived and the sacrifices of Captain Grant, he volunteered at a local veterans center, quietly helping others who bore invisible scars. He listened, shared his story when needed, and found that by reaching out, his own wounds continued to heal. Sometimes he brought Shadow along, the Mustang's calm presence bringing comfort to those who needed it most. For Ethan, giving back felt natural, a way to honor Grant's memory and the hard-won lessons of their journey. Emma, too, became a beacon of hope for others. Her story of courage, loss, and friendship reached children struggling with their own storms. She wrote an essay about Shadow for her class, describing how trust and kindness could turn even the wildest fear into something beautiful. Her words found their way into the local paper, then to a wider audience. Letters arrived from children across the country, some scared, some lonely, all hungry for a story of hope. Emma replied to each, her belief in brighter tomorrows unwavering. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm of work and joy. Mornings began early, with the scent of coffee and the warmth of sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor. Ethan and Emma rode out together, checking fences and herding cattle, Shadow never far from their sides. Some days, they simply explored racing the wind, marveling at herds of antelope, or resting beneath the broad sky as clouds drifted by. In these moments, the past felt distant, its shadows replaced by light and laughter. On one golden morning, father, daughter, and Mustang gathered on a low ridge as the sun crested the hills. The land below stretched out in a patchwork of gold and green, the ranch at its heart, the world full of possibility. Ethan put his arm around Emma's shoulders, both of them silent in the glow of the new day. Shadow stood beside them, his breath steaming in the chill air. His ears flicked forward to catch the first songs of birds. As the sun rose higher, Ethan felt a profound gratitude, a quiet certainty that, for all they had lost, so much more had been found. They had faced fear, betrayal, and darkness together, and come through not just intact, but stronger. The ranch was no longer just a reminder of what was gone, but a home, alive with memories, laughter, and hope for the future. In the years to come, the story of Ethan, Emma, and Shadow would be told and retold. How a wild Mustang brought a broken family back together, how truth and courage exposed long-buried secrets, and how love, quiet, steadfast, and enduring, could heal even the deepest wounds. But for now, as the three of them rode out beneath the endless sky, the only story that mattered was the one they were writing together, every single day. And as Shadow galloped freely across the Wyoming plains, his mane streaming in the wind, he became a living symbol of loyalty, of healing, and of the unstoppable power of hope.